The punishment of stoning to death, as commanded in the laws in the Old Testament of the Bible, is a subject that tends to be avoided or glossed over by Christians in general, even today. The problem is that Jesus or his apostles or the authors of the Gospels never condemn these kind of punishments or, in fact, any of the other harsh biblical laws anywhere in the New Testament. And in fact, you could also extend this to other punishments like crucifixion, which were commonly used by the Romans on criminals and rebels against Roman rule, etc., in Jesus' time. Two common robbers, for example, were crucified with Jesus, so this was pretty much an accepted and common occurrence in those times. But Jesus has absolutely nothing to say about these savage Jewish and Roman laws during his lifetime, and in fact, any harsh punishment or brutal practices of that time, including slavery. But returning to the subject of stoning to death, Christian pastors and preachers of today tend to ignore or steer clear of this issue as well. And this applies just as much to the Christian Pentecostal preachers you find operating all throughout Punjab today as well. And the video we're going to go through today is a good example of this. The pastor we're going to watch and discuss not only avoids the issue and the implications of stoning to death as mandated by the biblical God, but also makes several mistakes as well in just a few minutes going through the relevant New Testament story in his sermon. And that is the story of the adulterous woman in the Gospel of John, chapter 8. The story is about a woman who is brought before Jesus by a group of Jews, and they ask him his opinion as to whether she should receive the punishment of stoning to death as specified in the scriptures for transgressors. It's a pretty short story, like all these episodes about Jesus in the New Testament, so it's only a few lines long, so there's not a lot of detail. Now, as you can see, this pastor has given the video an intriguing title, Yeshu Masih ne likhe sabde paap, meaning Jesus writes down everyone's sins. Now, I don't recall this happening anywhere in the Bible, never mind John chapter 8, so this should be interesting. So let's investigate, let's dive into it. The pastor in question is a chap called Harpreet Deol. He's one of the most well-known pastors in Punjab, and he runs a ministry near Kapurthala at the village of Khojiwala with his wife, who runs her own social media channels as well. Now, this guy, like a lot of these pastors, claims to have done a few miracles of his own, healing cancer patients, etc. So the same fairly stereotypical claims that all these evangelical guys seem to make. So, before we go through what Jesus thinks about the issue of a woman being threatened with stoning to death, to make sure everyone's on the same page, let's see where the Bible advocates stoning for adultery. Well, it does this in not one but two places in the Old Testament. The first is in Leviticus chapter 20, and the second is in Deuteronomy chapter 22. And there is no confusion here, and the law is written very clearly and unambiguously. In fact, you could stone a person to death for quite a lot of other supposed crimes as well. And these include blasphemy, idolatry, cursing or striking parents, breaking the Sabbath, being rebellious towards your parents, being a false prophet, and various sexual sins. But we'll leave those subjects for another time. And as you can see, none of these activities are treated as actual criminal activities these days, although some may be unethical or immoral. But being rebellious towards your parents, for example, is hardly something children should be killed for. And others, for example, breaking the Sabbath, aren't even practiced by Christians themselves these days. And a person wouldn't be sentenced to even a day in prison these days for any of these activities, never mind being stoned to death. So, we obviously live in much more forgiving and enlightened times than 2,000 years ago. But the question is, why didn't Jesus condemn these rules and laws? Okay, let's just run through the story in John chapter 8 very quickly first before we see how this pastor goes through it, and then discuss Jesus' attitude on the issue. So we have Jesus going to Jerusalem at some point, and he happens to be in the temple, and some Jews bring a woman to him who'd committed adultery, and apparently she was caught in the act. And this group of people tell him that under the biblical law, she should be stoned to death, but they ask him his opinion as to what should be done. But Jesus stays silent and scribbles something on the temple ground and refuses to comment for some reason. Now, they continue to ask him, to which he then says, quote, "He that is without sin amongst you, let him first cast a stone at her." In other words, he's telling them that none of them is perfect either, so who are they to judge her? And this they understand, and they all leave, leaving just Jesus and the woman. And Jesus then gets up and sees the people have all gone and turns around to the woman and says he doesn't condemn her either and tells her to go and sin no more. And that's the end of the story. Now, there are a couple of important caveats and points to note about this Bible story. First of all, the story only appears in the Gospel of John, chapter 8. It does not appear in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, which are called the synoptic Gospels, because they tend to broadly agree and confirm one another and cover the same sort of ground. The Gospel of John is pretty much on its own in terms of covering very different material and what Jesus says, and therefore it's very suspect anyway and is treated differently by most Christian scholars. The second issue, which the pastor should also have mentioned but fails to, is that the story doesn't feature in the earliest versions of the Gospel of John that we have either. The earliest versions of the Gospel of John that are in existence are called P66 and P75, and these are either from the late 2nd century or the early 3rd century, and the oldest complete Bibles that we have are called Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, and these are from the 4th century. Now, none of these 4 early documents containing the Gospel of John contain this particular story, and this story only begins to mysteriously appear in the Gospel from the 4th century onwards and became fairly common in Bibles by the 6th century. So, this story was obviously inserted into the Gospel at a later stage by someone or other, it seems. So, it's important to remember that it's not part of the original Gospel, but a later corruption and addition. Now, this corruption of the text itself raises questions. If we are to believe these Gospels are divinely inspired, as Christians believe, then a later insertion like this obviously makes them less trustworthy. And in fact, we know there are various other later insertions and modifications as well in the New Testament. But I'll leave this issue for the time being. But this is something that the preacher should have mentioned for what it's worth, assuming he is aware of this, which may or may not be the case. Anyway, it's about time we went through the video itself. We'll go through the more minor problems as the pastor goes through the story first, and then we'll go through the more intractable and problematic and more philosophical issues regarding Jesus and his attitude towards stoning and the biblical laws. And I've added in subtitles to the video for those who don't understand Punjabi.
ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਨਾ ਹਰ ਜਦੋਂ ਬੰਦਾ ਫਸ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਨਾ ਜਦੋਂ ਨੂੰ ਹੀ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਰਸਤਾ ਹੀ ਹੈ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੋਈ ਉਦੋਂ ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਰਾਹ ਕੱਢ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਬਾਈਬਲ 'ਚ ਬਹੁਤ ਵਾਰੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਰਾਹ ਕੱਢੇ ਨੇ ਇੱਕ ਰਾਹ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਦਿਖਾਣਾ ਮੈਂ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਔਰਤ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੀ ਹੈ
Okay, so this is just a preamble by this pastor where he's building up Jesus as divine and as a remarkable character, solving problems where there doesn't seem to be any solution, and learned people of that time don't have a clue what to do. So we'll ignore that and carry on.
ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਲੋਕ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਫੱਕੀ ਫਰੀਸੀ ਧਰਮੀ ਗ੍ਰੰਥੀ ਪ੍ਰਧਾਨ ਮੋਤਵਾਰ ਉਹ ਸਾਰੇ ਇਕੱਠੇ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਇੱਕ ਔਰਤ ਨੂੰ ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਦੇ ਕੋਲ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਗਏ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਇਹਨੇ ਨਾ ਪਾਪ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਬਾਈਬਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਔਰਤ ਪਾਪ ਕਰੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਪੱਥਰਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਮਾਰ ਦਿਓ
Okay, so he says important Jewish figures take a woman to Jesus and claim that she has sinned and that the penalty for sin in the Bible is to be stoned to death. Now, for some reason, he doesn't say the sin was specifically adultery and that she was actually caught in the act, according to the story, proving her guilt. Now, either he doesn't know the story properly or more likely he deliberately avoids mentioning this problem because it raises uncomfortable issues on the harsh punishment advocated in the Bible for this kind of crime. But even more importantly, he doesn't discuss the issue of why a slow and torturous death like stoning is commanded in the Bible at all. If you are going to put someone to death, why not give them a quick death, like beheading, for example?
ਹੁਣ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਬਾਹਰ ਲੈ ਗਏ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਪੱਥਰ ਮਾਰ ਕੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਮਾਰਨਾ ਤੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਬੈਠੇ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਹਰ ਵਕਤ ਇਦਾਂ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਗੁਰੂ ਨੂੰ ਫਸਾਓ ਕਿਸੇ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਪੁੱਛੋ ਬਾਰ-ਬਾਰ ਆ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਕਿਦਾਂ ਤੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਦੇ ਕੋਲ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਗਏ ਨਾ ਤੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮੋਤਵਾਰ ਲੀਡਰ ਆ ਸਾਰੇ ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਦੇ ਮੂਹਰੇ ਐਨ ਖੜ ਗਏ ਥੰਮ ਬਣ ਕੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਦੱਸ ਬਈ ਕੀ ਕਰਨਾ ਇਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕੀ ਕਰੀਏ ਅਸੀਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਤੇ ਆ ਹੋਗਾ ਮੈਂ ਬਾਣੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਕੀ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਹੈ
So he says they take her outside, ready to be stoned, and where Jesus is sitting. But it doesn't actually say that in the gospel account. It says Jesus was inside the temple, but that's a minor point. They simply bring her to him and ask him what his opinion is. The story doesn't say they have any intention of carrying out the punishment. It simply states that they claim it is Jewish law for that particular crime and they want to know his opinion.
ਮੰਨ ਲਓ ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉੱਥੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕੀ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਸੀ?
So at this point, he's asking the congregation what they would have said. Now, I know what I would have said immediately and what he should be saying as well. And in fact, what Jesus should have said, that stoning is and was a barbaric punishment, even in Jesus' time. And she needs to be shown mercy and that the biblical laws are wrong in advocating capital punishment of this act. It's not like the people of that time didn't know what mercy was. Mercy is something innate within us, no matter where and when we're born, even if it was 2,000 years ago. Now, if this law on stoning people to death for this or that crime was written in the Sikh holy scriptures, the Guru Granth Sahib, I would leave Sikhi right now, no question at all, and I would condemn this ruling. The issue of capital punishment being ordained by God for something like this is a complete contradiction of the belief in an all-merciful God. You can't have it both ways. You can't have a God that is all-merciful but unequivocally advocates brutal punishment like this. But the pastor doesn't condemn this ruling in the Bible at all. And the fact that the Bible says that the woman should be stoned to death is not causing any alarm bells to ring inside the pastor's head. And neither does it seem to ring any alarm bells with his congregation, who are sitting there meekly listening to him. It simply raises no questions in their minds about the validity of these harsh biblical laws and then, by extension, the Bible itself. But let's hear what the pastor recommends on what should happen to the woman.
ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹੀ ਕਹਿ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਚਲੋ ਕੋਈ ਨਹੀਂ ਵੇਟ ਕਰ ਲਓ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਚੈੱਕ ਕਰ ਲਓ ਗਲਤ ਨਾ ਹੋਵੇ ਹੈਨਾ ਇਨਵੈਸਟੀਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਾਂ ਪਾ ਦੇਣਾ ਸੀ ਕੇਸ.
So instead of condemning this brutal punishment outright and explicitly, this pastor recommends an investigation. Now, he obviously hasn't read the story properly, as in verse 4 it explicitly says she was caught in the act. And the woman herself is hardly complaining or arguing against the accusation either, so an investigation is hardly necessary. So another minor mistake by this pastor, but we won't hold that against him. But let's say it did need an investigation to prove her adultery and she was still found guilty. Would he agree with the stoning of the woman to death as the Bible recommends? He doesn't tell us his position on this issue, but let's carry on.
ਪਰ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪਰਮੇਸ਼ਰ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਸਰਵ ਸ਼ਕਤੀਮਾਨ ਪਰਮੇਸ਼ਰ ਹੈ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਸਭ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਬਾਰੇ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਹੈ. ਲਿਖਿਆ ਬਾਣੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਉੱਠੇ ਨੀਵੇਂ ਹੋਏ ਉਂਗਲੀ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਨਾ ਥੱਲੇ ਜ਼ਮੀਨ ਤੇ ਨਾਂ ਲਿਖਣ ਲੱਗ ਪਏ ਫਲਾਨਾ ਸਿੰਘ ਫਲਾਨਾ ਕੁਮਾਰ ਫਲਾਨਾ 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 ਤੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਕੀ ਮੇਰਾ ਵੀ ਨਾਂ ਲਿਖਤਾ ਮੇਰਾ ਵੀ ਨਾਂ ਲਿਖਤਾ. ਫਿਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਹਾ ਦੱਸੋ ਕੀ ਕਰੀਏ ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆ ਥੱਲੇ ਕਾਂਡੇ ਮਾੜੇ ਮਾਰੀ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਮਿੱਟੀ 'ਚ ਉਂਗਲਾਂ ਮਾਰਨ ਦਾ ਕੀ ਫਾਇਦਾ.
So he says that Jesus writes down all their names in the dust on the ground. Well, actually, if we look at verse 6, Jesus doesn't write down any names at all. He merely scribbles something on the floor. Now, this is a clear and blatant embellishment of the story by the pastor. But the more important point is, why does Jesus hesitate to reply? That's the real issue. Surely he should have replied immediately and very clearly that the woman shouldn't be stoned and that they should show mercy. And that is what I think most people would certainly have done, rather than saying nothing and then scribbling on the floor.
ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਉਹ ਪੱਥਰ ਮਾਰੇ ਜਿਹਨੇ ਪਾਪ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤਾ. ਸਾਰੇ ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਅੱਖਾਂ ਖੁੱਲੀਆਂ ਰਹਿ ਗਈਆਂ ਤੇ ਕਮਾਲ ਹੈ.
So this is the climax of the story, if you like, with Jesus telling them that whoever is without sin can cast the first stone. In other words, they're not fit to judge the woman since they're not perfect either. And he says the people were astonished by this answer. Now, the Bible doesn't say that, but we'll allow him a bit of leeway in terms of artistic license to make the story more interesting.
ਤੇ ਜਦ ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਨੇ ਇਦਾਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਨਾ ਵੀ ਪੱਥਰ ਉਹ ਮਾਰੇ ਜਿਹਨੇ ਪਾਪ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤਾ, ਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਥੱਲੇ ਪਾਪ ਲਿਖਣ ਲੱਗ ਪਏ। ਬੰਦੇ ਦਾ ਨਾਂ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਮੋਰੇ ਸਟੇਟਮੈਂਟ ਤੇ ਲਿਖਿਆ।
So this guy is claiming Jesus writes down their sins as well on the floor. Now, this is complete nonsense and another clear embellishment of the story. Writing down all these names and their sins on the ground would be, with his fingers in the dust, would hardly be possible anyway. But as you can see, he's selling this video with the clickbait title, Yeshu Masina Leke Sabdebab, meaning Jesus writes down all their sins. So yeah, he obviously doesn't know the story very well. Anyway, let's carry on with the video and see what happened next.
5 ਮਿੰਟ ਨਹੀਂ ਲੱਗੇ, ਸਾਰੇ ਬੰਦੇ ਭੱਜ ਗਏ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਸਭ ਦੇ ਸਭ ਕੀ ਸੀਗੇ। ਕਈ ਵਾਰੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੂਜਾ ਪਾਪੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਲੱਗਦਾ, ਉਹਦੀ ਛੋਟੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਗਲਤੀ ਵੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਬੱਲੇ 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 ਏਡਾ ਮੈਂ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਜਾਣਦਾ, ਇਹ ਬੜਾ ਪਾਪੀ ਹੈ। ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਵਿਕਲਪ ਦਾ ਪਰਮੇਸ਼ਰ ਹੈ, ਉਹ ਵਿਕਲਪ ਕੱਢ ਕੇ ਦਿੰਦਾ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਇਸ ਹਾਲਾਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਨਿਕਲਣਾ, ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਆਜ਼ਾਦੀ ਪਾਉਣੀ ਹੈ। ਜਿੱਡੀ ਮਰਜ਼ੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮ ਹੋਵੇ, ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਇਹੀ ਦੱਸਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ, ਅੱਜ ਯਿਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਜੀਵਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਨਵਾਂ ਸਮਾਧਾਨ ਕੱਢ ਕੇ ਬਾਹਰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਓਗੇ।
So he tells us that the people realize that they are sinners as well and cannot then cast the first stone, and so they depart the scene. Now, the way he is telling this story makes it look like the decision to help the woman was a momentous and very dramatic one that no one else could have thought of. But this is, as mentioned earlier, simply an act of mercy for someone who's committed a mistake but hardly needs to be killed in barbaric fashion. And I'm pretty sure most, if not all, people would have acted to save the woman from stoning. So there's nothing profound in the story in that sense. While we're on the subject, I was recently watching a video by another pastor who was talking about the same story, and he also claims Jesus was writing their sins on the ground as well, strangely enough. Now, this is a chap called Pastor Harpreet Deol from New York, I believe, so let's quickly listen to him as well and see what he has to say.
ਯਸੂ ਕੋਲ ਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਔਰਤ ਆਈ, ਫੜੀ ਗਈ ਗੰਦਾ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦੀ, ਬੰਦੇ ਫੜ ਲਿਆਏ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਤੇ ਯਸੂ ਦੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਲਿਆ ਕੇ ਰੱਖਤਾ। ਤੇ ਯਸੂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਵੀ ਯਸੂ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਹਾ ਇਹ ਔਰਤ ਗੰਦਾ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦੀ ਫੜੀ ਗਈ ਆ, ਤੇ ਬਚਨ 'ਚ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਇਦਾਂ ਦੀ ਨੂੰ ਪੱਥਰ ਮਾਰ ਕੇ ਮਾਰ ਦਿਓ। ਪਰ ਯਸੂ ਮਸੀਹ ਨੇ ਕੀ ਕਿਹਾ? ਹਾਲੇਲੂਇਆ। ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਈਸ਼ਵਰ ਸੀਗਾ, ਜਿਹੜਾ ਢੱਕਣ ਵਾਲਾ ਆ, ਉਹਨੇ ਉਹ ਸਾਰੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਫੜ ਕੇ ਲਿਆਏ ਸੀ, ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਕਰਤੂਤਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕੀ ਕਰਦਾ ਸੀਗਾ? ਜਾਣਦਾ ਸੀ। ਉਹਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਆ ਜਾਓ, ਫਿਰ ਪੱਥਰ ਮਾਰਨ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਅੱਗੇ ਆਓ। ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਅੱਗੇ ਆਇਆ ਉਹਦੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਜ਼ਮੀਨ ਤੇ ਲਿਖ ਕੇ ਰੱਖਤਾ, ਪੜ੍ਹਿਆ ਨਹੀਂ, ਆਪ ਹੀ ਪੜ੍ਹ ਲਾ ਪੁੱਤ, ਆਪਣੀ ਕਰਤੂਤ ਕੀ ਕਰ ਲਾ, ਤੂੰ ਇਸ ਬੇਟੀ ਦੇ ਪੱਥਰ ਮਾਰਨ ਦੇ ਲਾਇਕ ਨਹੀਂ, ਲਾਇਕ ਨਹੀਂ। ਆ ਪੜ੍ਹ ਲਾ। ਪੜ੍ਹਦੇ ਗਏ, ਪੱਥਰ ਸਿੱਟ ਕੇ ਪਿੱਛੇ ਹਟਦੇ ਗਏ। ਕਾਰਨ ਕੀ ਸੀਗਾ? ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਇਹ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਲੈ ਆਏ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੰਦਾ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਨਹੀਂ ਲਿਆਏ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਗੰਦਾ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ ਸੀ। ਹਾਲੇਲੂਇਆ, ਹਾਲੇਲੂਇਆ।
Okay, it seems that these Punjabi pastors are either teaching each other an embellished story, or some of the Bibles translated into Punjabi and perhaps other languages like Hindi have a corrupted and extended version of the story in them as well. Who knows? But this guy is claiming that Jesus lets the woman off the hook because the man who was in the adulterous relationship with her was not apprehended and subject to punishment, and that he should be punished as well. Now, while you could agree or disagree with the logic of both being punished, that's not what is written in the Bible. Jesus doesn't condemn her because the people who came to him are not saints either and have also sinned. The man who had relations with the woman is not mentioned by Jesus at all. But leaving that aside, this Pastor Harpreet Deol also doesn't explore the issue of stoning to death as specified in the Bible either, and why Jesus also doesn't condemn the practice explicitly. Now, this is where this pastor leaves the story and goes into preaching mode, so we'll leave the video at this point, but just a few other quick points on this story and general impressions before we get to the more important issues. Now, if the Bible wasn't considered divine or divinely inspired, these issues wouldn't matter so much. But because the claim is that it is divinely inspired, then that creates a number of problems. The main issue is that this story, like most of the other stories on Jesus, typically doesn't contain any real details. And if the New Testament was divinely inspired, you could expect a much more complete and comprehensive story than a very short paragraph. Firstly, there is no date or year mentioned as to when he went to the temple, so we have absolutely no idea when this event took place. Secondly, no names of the learned Jews who came to him are given, and even the name of the woman whose life he saved is missing. Thirdly, the story is obviously written to magnify Jesus in the eyes of his followers, but nevertheless, the other characters in the story are shown as very limited and one dimensional and without much to say. None of the learned Jews is shown to have any inclination for mercy towards the woman, and being learned, you would think they would have more of a discourse on the subject rather than simply listening to Jesus' one line answer and then running away. So, when Jesus says, "Whoever is without sin, let him cast the first stone," for example, no one questions Jesus as to why he is blatantly ignoring the law, which comes directly from God. The law doesn't say punishment needs to be carried out by people without sin. That's the important point. If someone is found guilty, they can be punished by others, but instead, these learned men ask no questions and simply slip away. And the men aren't the only ones with not much to say. You would think the woman would be arguing her case and that they should show mercy towards her. And finally, we don't even know what happened to the woman either. The woman doesn't thank Jesus for saving her life, and she simply departs the scene and is never heard of again. And you would think that she would become one of the strongest disciples of Jesus, considering he'd saved her from a barbaric and brutal death. But she never turns up again, not even at the crucifixion. Certainly the Gospels never mention her again. So this story, like all the other Bible stories, has an artificial and anecdotal feel to it, and it's incomplete in many ways. Now, if the Bible wasn't divinely inspired, as mentioned, then that's fine, as you would expect flaws and missing details. But if it is divinely inspired, then we need to expect far higher standards and a much more complete story. Anyway, those are some of the more minor issues with the story and video, but let's get to the main issues and problems that this story creates. The first is regarding Jesus' attitude in this story to the punishment of stoning according to biblical law. And the problem relates to whether you think of him as divine or if you think of him as human. And both approaches, whether he is God or human or even both, have problems for Christians. Now, if we treat Jesus as human and as a Jew, which he was, then these laws were written in the scriptures that Jesus believed in. Jesus never criticized the Jewish scriptures at all, and so the rules and regulations within them were something that he was taught and laws that he believed in as well. Now, as a human, he should have either agreed with the law and shown himself as unmerciful, which would have been wrong, or he could have shown mercy, which he did, but then he goes against the very code that he's been brought up to preach. So there is no middle ground there. You either believe in the laws of Moses or you don't. You cannot sit on the fence. Now, Jesus in the event does sit on the fence. He does the right thing by showing mercy, but what he should have done was show courage at this point and gone much, much further. And that is by declaring the law on stoning to death to be completely unjust and barbaric. That was the right thing to do and the only thing to do, but which he fails to do. He ignores the issue of stoning in the Jewish scriptures and refuses to condemn these laws outright. And this is something all of us, I think, would have no hesitation in doing if we were in his place. Stoning a woman to death is clearly wrong. On the other hand, if we treat Jesus as divine, then we have an even bigger problem. The laws in the Old Testament were given to Moses by God, and if Jesus is God himself, then the laws for punishment by stoning came from Jesus himself. He was the one who imparted them to Moses. The traditional story in the Bible is that these laws were communicated to Moses on Mount Sinai by God, so Moses didn't dream them up himself, so Jesus should actually still be defending stoning by death, if anything. Otherwise, he's going against his own decrees that he gave to the Jews, if we accept for a moment that he is God. By showing mercy, he is effectively contradicting his own laws, and God, by definition, being perfect, cannot contradict himself. And staying on the same issue, and somewhat amusingly, we find Jesus is not following what he's just said. let him without sin cast the first stone. Remember, Jesus is divine and therefore without sin according to Christians. So, by his own standards, he should perhaps have stepped up and thrown the first stone. But he doesn't. He elects to go the more merciful route, and rightfully so. In other words, he doesn't follow his own commandments that he himself gave to the Jews. The other issue is Jesus' general silence on brutal punishments like this. Now, as you can imagine, a subject like stoning to death is something most people would have a strong and clear opinion on. And that is that this form of brutal death is not justified, no matter what the crime is. Now, regardless of whether you think of Jesus as divine or not only does Jesus stay silent in front of this group of Jews on the subject of stoning, but he also remains silent on this issue during his entire period of his ministry. And in fact, he stays silent on all the draconian punishments in the biblical scriptures. You could be put to death for working during the Sabbath, for instance, or even something as trivial as eating leavened bread during Passover could result in being banished from the Jewish community. And that is problematic, especially if you think Jesus is divine and all-merciful. He should have spoken up clearly and unambiguously on these issues. So, moving on, what are the other characters in the New Testament which the Christians give more credence to than the Old Testament say on the matter? People like Peter and Paul, etc., or the Gospel writers themselves. Well, this punishment by stoning is not condemned in the New Testament either. The Gospels were written much later, around 50 years and more after Jesus' death, and in no place do the Gospel writers condemn the act of stoning people to death, or in fact any kind of cruel or barbaric punishment that was common in those days. But the biggest issue with many of Jesus' teachings and moral platitudes is that while they sound correct and wise, as in this case, in the real world, they would be very difficult to carry out and are inherently impractical. Stoning people to death is wrong and cruel, and Jesus was right to show mercy to the woman. But on the issue of judging people, we cannot reject or ignore laws and punishment for crime simply because no one is perfect and sinless. If judgment or punishment can only be carried out by people who've committed no crime or sin, then no punishment at all can take place. Judges would not be able to sentence murderers or other criminals because they're not perfect either, and even petty criminals could not be punished. The truth is we do need the law, and we need judges and policemen, even though they may be flawed and imperfect and not sinless. The system we have in the modern world is a good one. I can judge someone even though I may not be perfect, and someone else can judge me even though they may not be perfect. You cannot reject a system of law simply because nobody is perfect. And you cannot wait for a judge who is sinless and perfect to come along, because that will never happen. And that is what happens in the modern world in all Christian countries, never mind non-Christian places. We have trials for crimes with judges and juries who are imperfect people, but who can perfectly judge misdemeanors in others. So while Jesus was right to not side with the people putting forward the case to put her to death, his reason was wrong. The reason should have been mercy, and mercy alone, not that they are also sinners. So anyway, those are the many issues that arise from this short story, but what are the workarounds employed by Christians for these issues? And how do Christians explain Jesus' general silence on the brutal punishments of his time? Well, most Christians these days, as mentioned, tend to dismiss the Old Testament directives out of hand and simply gloss over the laws and let them pass without a comment, as this pastor is doing. The standard answer will be that these punishments were fit for that time, the time before Jesus, but that the old laws of Moses in the Old Testament aren't valid after Jesus. And the reason given is that these laws are superseded by the New Testament and by the arrival of Jesus, and that he, quote, fulfilled the law, whatever that means. And by dismissing them like that, they tend to get brushed under the carpet and therefore almost entirely ignored, as if there was nothing wrong with them at all and that stoning was fine before the time of Jesus. Now, there are several problems with this kind of reasoning. First of all, Jesus never said that the laws of Moses were at an end. He never criticized these laws as mentioned, and he never said stoning people to death is wrong. He didn't say abolish the Sabbath. He didn't condemn circumcision. He didn't eat pork meat or say that people can now eat pork. He believed and kept to the laws of Moses himself, albeit employing a more human and softer edge sometimes, as in the story of the adulterous woman. In fact, he clearly said the opposite. In Matthew 5, verses 17 to 18, he says, quote, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or one tittle will by any means disappear from the law until all is fulfilled," unquote. So he could not be clearer that he was fully committed to the Jewish law, which is understandable since the laws came from him, if we assume he is divine. Secondly, Jesus' disciples like Peter, who knew him best and travelled with him as he preached, argued for keeping the law as well, and therefore there were differences in opinion between them and Paul on this issue. Now, surely we have to value their opinion higher than Paul's, who never met Jesus, but who essentially pushed for the law to be removed for Gentile Christians. Thirdly, it's important to remember that these laws in the Bible were given for all time. There are no time limits specified in the Old Testament that some Messiah or other will come to earth, and that when this happens, these laws will become invalid or redundant. Another workaround that modern Christians put forward for Jesus' silence on these issues is that these kind of punishments were not very common, and that times had moved on, and that Jews weren't openly stoning people during Jesus' time anyway. In other words, these punishments were really just a remnant of the past and not worth commenting on by Jesus. But that is not the case. Stoning wasn't rare or infrequent during the time of Jesus. We know that because Jesus himself was threatened with being stoned to death several times if the Bible stories are true. In the very same chapter of John, chapter 8, for example, in verse 59, the Jews try to stone him, but Jesus manages to hide from them and run away. And again, a short while later in John chapter 10, verse 31 to 33, we again have the local Jews making moves to stone him. They again accuse him of blasphemy, but verse 39 tells us that he managed to run away from them again and therefore avoided death. So he's faced this issue himself at various times. And in fact, various disciples of his were threatened or killed in this manner as well, according to the New Testament. Stephen, generally seen as the first Christian martyr, was stoned to death as described in Acts chapter 7. And Paul on his travels is nearly stoned according to Acts 14 at Iconium, but he manages to flee the scene. And a short while later in Lystra, I believe, as specified in the same chapter, the locals managed to stone him and leave him for dead. So this idea that this was a very infrequent occurrence and that it only happened rarely is untrue. Stoning to death was something that could be seen happening commonly up and down the country and even beyond Judea and in the Roman Empire, as both Jesus and Paul found out in their travels. Now, all the above was specifically to do with the Old Testament justice, but we can in fact extend the issue and problem to the more famous Roman laws of the time on crime and punishment. People guilty of various crimes could be enslaved, for example, and other transgressors could be burnt to death or fed to hungry beasts in the Roman arenas. And these were the common and cruel punishments for criminals in the Roman Empire. And of course, the most famous punishment was death by crucifixion. Crucifixion was commonly and routinely carried out by the Romans on criminals, bandits, highwaymen, and rebels against Roman authority and so on, being the standard punishment for these kind of crimes. And there is no doubt that Jesus saw the Romans crucifying criminals and petty thieves or Jews fighting against Roman rule. In his lifetime, he must have seen a fair number of these people being crucified on the sides of the roads, up and down the country of Judea as he travelled around. And of course, when he was crucified himself, 2 thieves were also crucified with him. So you would think not only Jesus, but Paul and the other apostles and the writers of the Gospels too would have a very strong opinion on these kind of brutal punishments by the Romans. Now, surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, Jesus doesn't condemn these kind of Roman punishments either before his own death on the cross. So his silence on these very cruel punishments is problematic. And again, that is a hard thing to explain, given that Jesus is generally put forward as a more loving and less vengeful deity by Christians than the Old Testament God. And it's even more difficult to explain, given that if we assume Jesus was divine, then he knew he would face the cross and therefore should have been very forthright and public in preventing others from being crucified for smaller crimes. But in fact, Jesus not only fails to condemn crucifixion, but seems to go further and even accept Roman rule over his own people, never criticizing harsh Roman authority. And as we're told in the Gospels of Mark chapter 12, Matthew 22, and Luke 20, when he advises people to pay their taxes to Caesar. So he has no pretensions about freeing his own people from foreign rule. And that's surprising in itself. Jesus, God himself, the Messiah himself, implicitly accepting Roman imperial rule and laws over his own people and seeing his people in a state of bondage to the Romans. The Messiah, after all, was supposed to free his own people from subservience and bring in an era of independence, not the exact opposite, and accept foreign rule. And perhaps more surprisingly still, the apostles later on, after seeing Jesus, their own leader, die on the cross, never condemned the act of crucifixion either in the Acts of the Apostles. And even Paul in his letters has nothing negative to say about crucifixion or even stoning to death. Then again, maybe it's not surprising if we accept that Jesus and his apostles were not divine or divinely inspired. They were simply human beings, people of their time, and they accepted the laws of that time, just as we accept today's laws as neither too barbaric nor too liberal. So anyway, let's summarize a little on the lessons to be learned from the video by Harpreet Deol and the story of Jesus. And that is to look at the original story in the Bible rather than the sanitized and embellished version spun out by these pastors who stick to a superficial understanding but don't want to go through any issues that might stimulate doubt in their listeners and followers. So, with this story in the video, the points to think about are that firstly, Jesus doesn't condemn the practice of stoning people to death to the people who came to him, although he does rightly show mercy in this instance. Secondly, Jesus does not condemn any of the harsh Jewish laws anywhere, despite Christians rejecting the Mosaic laws. And thirdly, this pastor, Harpreet Deol, doesn't condemn stoning to death either. He simply mentions that an investigation is needed to take place, which is disturbing. Fourthly, if Christians believe Jesus is God, then this law in the Bible to stone people came from Jesus himself, and that raises plenty of issues regarding a divine being that has a dubious or cruel nature. Also, if we look at the New Testament, there is an implicit but clear acceptance of not just the laws and regulations of Jewish scriptures, but also Roman laws as well, however severe and harsh they are. And lastly, coming back to modern times, and we have our own modern judicial laws and civil laws that are much better thought out than the brute force biblical laws that God or Jesus himself gave to Moses. Adultery, while it's morally wrong, is simply not a criminal act for which someone should be sentenced to death. Anyway, that's it for this video. Let me know your thoughts on the biblical laws on stoning to death, especially if you're a Christian. And let me know why you think Jesus didn't openly condemn the practice of stoning anywhere in the New Testament, not just for adultery, but for a whole host of other supposed crimes. And in fact, why Jesus didn't condemn crucifixion either, even though it was commonly used in Judea by the Romans. Anyway, a big thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.